Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jochen Luckscheitzer. I'm the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation New Delhi office. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this dialogue on the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, Turning Potential into Progress, which is the opening session for a series of policy briefs and webinars focused on critical issues shaping the EU-India relationship, which we co-host and co-create or curate with the Council for Strategic and Defense Research as our knowledge partner. The series is in a way an extension of the India Foreign Policy series, which we started with CSDR last year. As India and Europe prepare for a long-awaited summit later this year, 2025 promises to be a defining year for the relationship between the two actors and regions. This, of course, unfolds against a backdrop of global volatility, from the ongoing war in the Ukraine to shifting power dynamics in the global order, including uncertainty in the transatlantic alliance. In such times, stable partnerships rooted in trust and shared interests become even more critical. Our project is grounded in the belief that stronger India-Europe ties are desirable for global stability, sustainable development, and also strategic resilience on both sides. Over the coming months, we will be exploring this relationship through various key themes, from technology cooperation and green energy to regional connectivity and the reform of the multilateral system. These are not just policy priorities, they are also avenues where India and Europe can together shape the international order in constructive ways. A defining feature of our initiative is the deliberate choice to pair for each policy brief one author from India with one from Europe. This approach reflects more than geographic diversity to us. It's a statement of purpose. In doing so, we want to bridge not only continents, but also perspectives, building narratives that are mutually informed and hopefully policy relevant. By facilitating collaboration across borders and across policy communities and across disciplines, we hope this project will contribute to the broader momentum of the EU-India relations that is currently unfolding. We believe policy alignment begins with intellectual alignment, and dialogue is a first step in that direction. Also would like to take the opportunity to thank CSDR for their continued collaboration, and of course, the two authors and all the other panelists and moderators here today who have agreed to share their time and insights with us. I look forward to rich discussions today and in the months to come. Thank you for being here, and once again, welcome. Over to you, Devika. Thank you.
Thank you, Jochen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending where you're joining us. My name is Devika. I work at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and I would also like to welcome you all on behalf of CSDR. Quick introduction to us. CSDR is a New Delhi-based think tank which combines global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in rigorous research and experiential knowledge. And our expertise broadly covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, geoeconomics, climate change, peace building, and tech policy, to name some, with regional expertise in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar, the EU-India TTC Turning Potential into Progress with HPS. This is the first of our collaborative policy brief series, India-Europe Relations, Advancing Policy Alignment. We are also here formally launching our first report of the series, tapping into the momentum the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, which has been co-authored by Dr. Amaia Sanchez and Professor Rajat Kathuria. Our attendees can find the report in the chat below. So without further ado, I want to quickly introduce our speakers. So today we have Dr. Karthik Nachiappan as our moderator. He's a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and his research focuses on India's geoeconomics and how issues like trade, technology, and climate change affect Indian foreign policy. Welcome, Karthik. Thank you so much for doing this today. Then we have our authors, Dr. Amaia Sanchez, Casiciro. Sorry if I butchered that. She's currently non-resident senior fellow for the Asia program at the Institut Montaigne in Paris, and also academic coordinator at the Global Policy Center at IE University in Madrid. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amaia. Then we have Professor Rajat Kathuria, who is Dean and Professor of Economics at the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Shiv Nadar University. He's also a senior visiting professor at ICRIA, that is the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, where he was also director and chief executive from 2012 to 2021. Welcome, Professor Kathuria. And finally, we have Viktoria Apitzsch, who's counselor, head of the Science and Technology section at the Embassy of Germany in New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us today, Viktoria. Dr. Hesselman was supposed to join us, but he was called away from a work emergency, and Viktoria is very graciously representing the German Embassy here today. Great. Thank you to all our panelists. Quick housekeeping notes. Please keep your opening remarks to 5 to 7 minutes and post the opening session and the moderated discussion. Attendees, we will open the floor for questions. Please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. So that's all from me. I will now hand over the proceedings to Karthik. Thank you, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Devika, and good afternoon, everyone from Singapore. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, where we will reflect and discuss how far this strategic mechanism, the TTC, has come since its inception, its evolution, and its future. And how can the TTC, which has been backed by intent and rhetoric, translate strategic motivation and objectives into mutually beneficial outcomes for Europe and India? Simply put, can Europe and India cooperate on technology? I think we appear to be at a hinge moment in EU-India ties. I think things have been moving fast, especially since 2025. There are parallel tracks of discussions and cooperation underway between both actors on defense, security, trade, and technology. And one pivotal and critical track is technology. How both partners can forge and accelerate a strategic compact on some critical and emerging technology issues like digital connectivity, clean energy technologies, and supply chains through the TTC. Now, the TTC is one big reason why we can say and think that the EU and India can meaningfully cooperate on tech issues going forward. This cooperation, at least so far, is underpinned by shared values. Both partners want an open, rules-based, and human-centric digital future. They have complementary capabilities and strengths, tech-wise. India is a software power that prioritizes innovation. It has a vibrant startup ecosystem, while Europe has advanced R&D capabilities and deep regulatory expertise on tech issues like AI, data, and green tech. And both have mutual strategic interests. They want to reduce their dependencies on China and the United States in these critical and emerging technologies. But there are also challenges ahead. There are definitely regulatory issues between both parties on matters like data, intellectual property rights, and market access. They could also be institutional inertia. These are both large bureaucracies, and things take time to move through them. So we have the opportunities and the challenges side by side. So can the TTC live up to this moment and deliver, moving the broader EU-India strategic partnership forward? I think so far, at least both parties have expressed a strong commitment to conclude a trade agreement by the end of 2025, which could enhance economic ties in cooperation in some of these tech areas and industries. We'll see whether and how that happens. But there's clearly momentum now in the relationship, given structural shifts in the international system. And as the EU and India prepare for a summit later this year, I think these shifting global dynamics will continue to play an important role in the relationship. So we'll cover some of these issues in the conversation today, and we have a great group of folks to talk about the TTC. We already know the format, 5 to 7 minutes for each speaker before Dr. Viktoria steps in with her intervention. So can I now ask Dr. Amaia Sanchez to kick us off? Amaia.
Thank you so much, Kartik. That was a fabulous introduction. You almost did the job for me. So thank you for that. I'll go ahead and sort of dwell slightly an overview really of our report, leaving the recommendations for Professor Kathuria to dwell into. I'm just going to touch upon some key ideas, broader framework, which, as I said, Kartik already did very well in explaining, and then also convergences and divergences in somewhat more detail. But of course, as Devika mentioned, you've got the reports available, so that's there. I think it's good to sort of frame things a bit in time, in the sense that when did the EU-India TTC come to be to begin with, right? It was in April 2022, following Ursula von der Leyen's visit to India. She was chief guest at Raisina Dialogue. And as a result of that, there's subsequent 2 meetings that have been held. It took a whole year for the first one to happen. That happened in May 2023 in Brussels. And just recently, there was a second meeting, again, 2 years later, almost, that took place in February 2025 with Ursula von der Leyen's visit, together with the whole College of Commissioners to New Delhi, which in itself was, I think, a very strong EU signaling. Now, one of the issues or ideas that I think we tried to at least bring through in the reports is the fact that, as it says in the name itself, right, the EU-India TTC does embed trade policies of both actors, as well as both actors' twin digital and green transitions. And I think we often tend to forget this, and that being that there's so many other aspects to it, as in economic security agendas, trade agendas, and whatnot. And I think that's important to highlight from the very beginning. Now, in terms of the broader framework, you already mentioned the fact that the momentum is very strong at the moment. There must be a renewal in the strategic agenda post for 2030. I'm not sure at this point whether there will be a summit happening, but there are at the moment, there's a sort of very strong momentum also behind the EU-India FTA negotiations, which have been ongoing for decades. But I think more importantly, and because we're going to be talking a lot about tech, is the fact that in terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics, there is, and Kartik, you mentioned this already, there is really, very, very harsh competition happening between the US and China. And in this respect, I think both the EU and India do find themselves a bit between a rock and a hard place. So it's clear that both actors are looking for strategic autonomy. They're looking to develop their own indigenous capacities in cutting-edge sectors such as quantum computing, communications, AI, of course, particularly AI hardware, data processing, and green tech. Now, moving on to, I thought it would be useful also to mention the sort of more EU-specific standpoint, even though, as was mentioned too before, the idea was not to just throw out there the EU viewpoint and the Indian viewpoint, but rather to merge both and make it a much more sort of conducive report. Now, just to say that from an EU standpoint, I mean, the EU does see India clearly as a fast-growing emerging economy, most populated country, immense potential as a consumer market, but in particular the TTC as a means to foster its own innovation, much needed, as you know, as a result of the Draghi report and others, also to strengthen its own autonomy, but also to, in the current conjuncture, with so much uncertainty, with, as you mentioned, the transatlantic relationship sort of up in the air, overcome its own reliance also on external technologies. And this is something that one of our interviews mentioned, it's in the report, Christina Cafara. She did also say it's not just about innovating and under-regulating, because there's this whole thing about the EU over-regulating. It's also about the EU producing commercially viable and deployable tech products. For example, at some point creating its own cloud space and much needed cloud infrastructure. The point about skilled labor, or rather the lack of, in critical sectors within the EU is something that came up also recurrently, not just in IT, but also in biotech or health. So this in itself, the lack of availability of skilled staff, despite the capital being there, is something that obviously from an EU standpoint is crucial. Now, in terms of shared interests, we've outlined them in the report as in what's been agreed to in the last meeting that happened in February. I don't necessarily want to go into all the details. I think we're going to have time to do that. But I do want to mention that there's 3 working groups, as you must know by now. First one being about strategic technologies, digital governance, and digital connectivity. Second one about clean and green tech. Third one about trade investment and resilient value chains. And the point we make in the report, and I think it's crucial, is the fact that perhaps the silos of these 3 working groups are in themselves not always helpful, because there are cross-cutting issues, as I mentioned before, value chains, trade, well, so many others, IP, intellectual property, and whatnot, that cut across. So that's one of our sort of critiques, and Professor Kathuria is going to develop on that much more. Now, in terms of convergences, which Kartik you pointed to, I'm just going to go a bit more in detail. In terms of, I think, digital public infrastructure is something we discussed in the report. The fact that India has open source, inclusive digital systems, that it's scalable as well, and that it's also a sort of ethical approach to IT is for us definitely a convergence. This then obviously affects the fact that they can work together, both actors in fintech, health tech. It can make both sort of systems more interoperable. And again, the fact India's capability to scale up, in a way confronting Europe's regulatory strengths, right? If you put both of them together, that in itself is very enriching. In terms of the hardware of IT, this is a point where perhaps because both of them are lacking in it, they can actually try and sort of work on it more. There is already an MOU in semiconductors that was signed in November 2023. And the aim here being trying to boost, in a way, the semiconductor supply chains and find sort of complementary strengths. But on this point, so far, it's been more, and we find there's more complementarity when it comes to actual research and, you know, basically, creating talent, joint talent, really, right, among students and young professionals. And this ties into the point I mentioned at the beginning, which is about migration and mobility, right, and skilled labor. And don't forget, I mean, India is, as we mentioned in the report, one of the world's sort of digital manufacturers, producing more than 1.5 million engineers from India's very prestigious IITs a year. This happens to coincide with Europe's current, you must have heard of this, launching of Choose Europe for Science program, which is backed by 500 million euros, which is not only attempting to sort of attract US brain drain, but also brain drain or whatever may come as in skilled labor for IT from other countries, obviously including India. Both countries would need to ramp up their AI ecosystems to sort of compete against this really bipolar dominance by the US and China, pretty much. And this then spills over into so many other sectors. I mean, we can talk about education, health, agriculture. So we see a lot of convergence there too, in potential. And finally, on green tech, here too, don't forget that both countries have an aim of achieving net zero emissions. The EU sooner than India, 20 years before, 2050, India 2070. So there's a lot that can be done here in terms of joint research, innovation, hopefully all for market uptake. And I underline this because, you know, it's not only about research. Eventually, as I mentioned before, we do think there's a need to connect better with the broader ecosystem, EU and Indian incubators. Am I out of time, Kartik?
Just about, if you want to make maybe one more point.
Just very briefly on divergences, which are really important. Clear differences in, as you mentioned, frameworks when it comes to digital, data privacy issues, digital governance. Yeah, we'll discuss this later, I think, much more in detail. The issue of EU sustainability regulations, CBAM, EUDR, fundamental as a sort of hindrance to some extent. And finally, I do want to mention too, the issue of know-how and tech transfer. You mentioned also, Kartik, intellectual property regulations, other kinds of non-tariff barriers. The report we mentioned quality control orders. And finally, and this is a key point, I think, too, the fear from an EU perspective that if there is tech transfer, what's actually going to happen with that in terms of third countries? So we're thinking of Russia and Iran, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amaia. That was a great overview of the EU side of the ledger. Dr. Kathuria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Karthik. Thank you, Amaia. Before I start, let me thank HBS, Heinrich, Böll, Stiftung, and CSDR for giving me this opportunity. It's been great to work with Amaia on this. So a lot of what I had to say has already been said. So let me sort of try and give you some more detail on that. If you look at India and its position in the world today, India happens to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Its population, as everybody is saying, is very, very high. It's now the most populous country in the world, 1.4 billion. It's overtaken China. It's also sort of finds itself as a multilateralist. It finds itself in a position where the multilateral system, if not broke, is certainly in a coma, and chances of revival in the immediate future do not seem very high. And therefore, India, much against its DNA, I wouldn't say completely against its DNA, much against its DNA as far as trade is concerned, especially, not so much security and technology, but as far as trade is concerned, has been a multilateralist, but it's finding itself in a position where it needs to engage much more bilaterally and regionally. And I think this is a good thing for India to do. And therefore, the relationship with Europe is not only a good timing, but also I think it can serve as a motive for India to move up the regulatory value chain, if you will. And I'll explain myself much more in the Q&A. But as Amaia said, I'm sort of going to focus on the sort of recommendations, which really follow from what Karthik and Amaia have already said. But just to provide the context, which is that one of the fastest growing economies, very large population, very large market, sort of hitherto multilateralist, but now engaging much more in regional and bilateral agreements. And also the fact that India and Europe are already trading a lot with each other. Europe is India's second largest trading partner, and therefore there seem to be synergies which can be honed as a result of the TTC. And as Karthik asked the question, is there value in the TTC? Of course there is value in the TTC, but I think not only in the TTC, but for TTC to have its sort of full impact, and if you will, as a force multiplier, then there will be a lot of other things that will need to be put into place, including, as Karthik and Amaia have both said, the FTA, which hopefully we will be able to put in place at least one version of it by the end of the year. So what are these synergies that we are talking about? And they flow from, as I said, what I've said as an introduction, and also what Amaia and Karthik have said. So one is, of course, mobility and migration. India finds itself on the positive end of the demographic transition, and Europe finds itself on the short end of the demographic transition, and therefore there are synergies there. But given that India's sort of population of 1.4 billion, it's not that all of them will migrate. There is a sort of restricted set, but that's still very high. India's middle class ranges between 300 million to 350 million. You know, they go to good schools, they go to universities, educate, and they sort of want to, some of them want to migrate, some of them want to go abroad. And as you know, there's a whole host of non-resident Indians in all parts of the world, including in Europe. So I think there's a synergy there. We can discuss much more of the details, but migration, which will add value both ways. And in the lexicon of an economist, that would be a Pareto improvement. The other thing that sort of can happen is, joint technology sharing, R&D, innovation. One of the weaknesses in India, and I'm not sure about Europe, one of the weaknesses in India, which we are now beginning to address through what is called the new education policy that we've put in place, is this collaboration between government, academia, and industry. Of course, it's there on paper, but in terms of how much it has been able to serve, it's been limited. And I think both Europe and India, through the TTC, can engage in much more. As Amaia is saying, there's funds available, there's skilled personnel available, and there's sort of intent. So all of that put together can lead to joint innovation for mutually beneficial gains. I'm not talking about security here. I'm talking much more about economic gains and economic inclusion. And the other thing about one of our recommendations is, as Amaia and Karthik have both said, about the regulatory landscape in the two countries. And obviously, with a per capita income of $3,000 roughly, and with Europe sitting at over $50,000, on some countries, of course, Europe, EU, 27 countries, so there's some divergences there. But, at high end of the spectrum, you would have over 50,000 per capita income, with India sitting at 3,000. So obviously, with this divergence in per capita incomes, not in overall size of the economies, but in terms of per capita incomes, obviously there would need to be regulatory harmonization, but that cannot happen from day one. So what the TTC and what the FTA can do for both India and Europe is to bring about some kind of regulatory coherence and regulatory convergence. But as I said, not immediately. This will necessarily happen over a period of time. And if I were to sort of say that India can use this momentum, can use the strategic sort of coming together to hone in some of its domestic reform. And I'll be happy to share more light on this during the Q&A session. Of course, we have to be guarded. So these are the structural, as it in the paper, if you read the paper, Amaia and I have 3 sets of recommendations. What I've just spoken about are the structural recommendations. Then, of course, we have sectoral recommendations and we have operational recommendations. In the sectoral recommendations, as Amaia have said, we can come together industry-wise, sector-wise, and green tech is obviously one example. Semiconductors is one example. Semiconductors, India happens to have 20% of all chip designers in the world. This is a report that is available online, and we've mentioned it in our paper as well, is 20% of all the chip designers in the world are Indian. So in terms of the supply side of skilled personnel, chip design in AI, there is availability, and between EU, where hardware upgradation is happening, we can come together and create joint AI capabilities. Also, there's collaboration between IITs and Europe's new Eurostack and the HPC. There are centers of excellence in Europe, and the IITs can come together. So there are sectoral recommendations, and of course there are synergies. And of course these synergies, they exist, but they can be sort of increased and improved as we move along. So, learning by doing. So we don't have to be sort of put everything in place from day one. The TTC and the forthcoming FTA can sort of hone these synergies much better in the future as well. And I'm about to conclude. The operational sort of recommendations are, as Amaia mentioned, we have 3 working groups in the digital, clean tech, and trade, investment, and resilient supply chains. And there are synergies between them. Obviously, you're going to trade in green tech, you're going to trade in technology, you're going to trade in data, you're going to trade in digital flows. So there's obviously synergies between these working groups. And while these working groups are 3 separate working groups, I think there should be a mechanism of breaking down the silos, whatever it is. I'm sure there is expertise within EU and India and within the working groups to decide how these synergies can be better exploited by creating some sort of an umbrella that links these working groups together. And of course, as Amaia mentioned, we need to meet regularly. Now that the FTA negotiations have been going on for such a long time, and we haven't been able to. So there is sort of strategic convergence that is happening, and we should take advantage of the momentum, but also not lose sight that if we don't pursue this, if we don't do it right away, then we lose another opportunity, and another opportunity will go a-begging. So we should have these meetings much more often. As Amaia mentioned, that the visit of delegations of Europe coming to India, Indian delegations should go to Europe. The working group should meet. Online is obviously an opportunity to do that, but convene regular meetings so that we don't lose the momentum. So I think I'll stop here, Karthik. But as I said, we've designed the sort of recommendation into structural aspects, into operational aspects, and into sectoral aspects. And I hope you will find time, some of the participants will find time to read the recommendations, and of course the entire paper. Thank you, Karthik.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Kathuria. I think we'll get back to some of these thoughts that you mentioned. I think it's important to also ask whether the form of the TTC is fit for purpose as it evolves. And I think your brief does that. It'll be good to examine and sort of come back to that in the discussion. Now it's my pleasure to ask Dr. Viktoria Apitzsch to also say a few words from the point of a European practitioner working on these issues from the German embassy in Delhi. Viktoria, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I can also agree that lots of interesting things have already been said. Hard to jump in there now, and I've already taken away things that I want to think about and, you know, kind of discuss with certain people later, or things that I take away from my daily work. I feel like the TTC itself, you know, is not a standalone entity in this discussion. I feel like it, on a day-to-day basis, it can certainly send the right signals towards European economy and research and so on. But it is up to all of us to actually identify India as the more ever-growing partner that it can be. So in short, what I want to say is that there is still a lot of potential that can be used. I certainly agree that the identified topics of the TTC, especially within green tech, especially within AI, quantum, are matters of shared interest. So it's going to be interesting if the industry actually manages to, you know, use this potential, identify India as the key partner, where we, as the embassy here, see it. You know, me being also the academic counselor of the embassy, I get to see a lot of, or get to interact with a lot of the talent that we are talking about here. I certainly agree that India provides a huge pool of talent that is incredible. If you look into the IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology, or certain second-tier universities as well, it's quite impressive, you know, the level of research that has been done there, and we can only increase collaboration on that level. However, there's also potential to increase meaning on a skilling level. If we want to tackle AI as is, which touches basically any of the sectors we will today talk about, any of the industrial sectors, any of our day-to-day life. We not only need a quantity of talent, but we need skilled talent in a sort. And even India now addressing AI with the AI mission has identified that within the semiconductor mission, for example, or the semiconductor investments that were mentioned before. All of us are struggling to find the talent to really build up the research and build up these companies. So that's going to be an interesting challenge nonetheless. Will we get enough talent to actually follow our ambitious goals? And the TTC, with its research approach and the adjacent Horizon research fund from the EU, I will talk about that maybe later a little bit more, is certainly a good way to go about. So the connection of the Horizon Fund and the TTC is ever more so important. And then, of course, we have already mentioned the FTA that now is moving forward between India and the EU. So I feel like with the conception of this, the TTC was already very helpful, because we could identify shared interests and go forward from there, basically. So within this, the TTC itself as a platform to start a dialogue and find out where we align, where we need to align more, has already been very impactful. And I think I keep it short and stop with that.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Viktoria. So we have about, I would say, 25 minutes or so for a discussion between ourselves before bringing the audience in. I just want to encourage all the members in the audience to place your questions in the chat, and we'll take that once we've concluded our discussion. So I want to just return to some of the points that have been made, and the brief is structured rather organically, rather neatly in three formats. So looking at the convergences, the divergences, and then the future, right? So I want to maybe just take it along those lines and just go through the brief and also touch upon some of the issues we've talked about. So let me just start with the convergence. You know, one of the things that so I've been kind of working on India's technology partnerships with a number of other countries and its tech diplomacy. And it looks to me like there's convergence with only a few, given how India is structured economically, its innovation, its technological ecosystem, its digital economy. So there is a natural convergence with the United States, right? And you've seen a lot of tech-focused initiatives that have come out of the US-India partnership. Increasingly, Southeast Asia, so certain countries in Southeast Asia are seen as important tech partners, especially Singapore. So I want to kind of place Europe here. Where does Europe fit into this kind of India's technology, tech diplomacy landscape? So maybe I'll start with Amaia. You kind of talked briefly about India's strengths and what India kind of means technologically for the EU. But it looks to me like there's a lot of strategic convergence. The TTC was commenced in 2022, right after the Ukraine war. India was facing difficulties with China. There were a lot of questions around the US with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of investment flowing in back to the US in the areas that the TTC does cover. So how much is largely strategic convergence, which both parties have, and they're hoping that would eventually extend into the tech space? Or how much is it a technological convergence that will come to meet the strategic side?
Thank you for that, Kartik. I mean, I definitely think it's, before anything else, a strategic convergence. And then I would argue tech comes as part of that, right? But just to sort of dwell a bit more into the detail now that I have a bit more time than before. I mean, I do think from Europe's lens, India fits very well in both strategic, as I mentioned before, and also in certain aspects of its own sort of tech industry, right? So we mentioned already extensively the issue of skilled manpower, but there's also, I mean, there's stuff going on telecommunications, for example, that I didn't mention before, in 6G. There's stuff going on in terms of green tech on green hydrogen. That's one of the key focus areas. There's also an offshore wind There's a number of, and DPI is fascinating because despite them having very different intentions, in the sense for India, DPI is a means of economic prosperity, right? It's a means, for example, it's allowed for financial inclusion, it's allowed for so many other social benefits to trickle down and so many other things, right? For Europe, it's more a means of, okay, let's now via IT and DPI try and sort of scale up and try and have more innovation. But even then, I do think there is convergence, as you mentioned, on it being a rules-based approach and on it being an open. India's approach is very much open source. It's not like China, right? So in that sense, I think they definitely align. However, it's not all rosy. And here's where I think things on regulation, I think that there's a definite clash here. I mean, I think there's on issues of data privacy. And again, this is not just about tech. I mean, this will then eventually impact, as I think Viktoria, you're mentioning, also European companies wanting to then work with Indian companies, because, for example, on issues of cross-border data flows, regulations are very different here. And the fact that, for example, Indian companies could then go on and pass data of EU users on without this being adequately regulated, this could be a massive issue, right? The fact that for India, national security and the role of the state is extremely important, right? And economic development, as opposed to, for example, privacy and individual rights on the part of the EU. I mean, that to me is a key caveat. Having said that, there was one point that you mentioned, and I think is important, and we emphasize this a lot in the report. And I think from an EU perspective, and this is probably why I argue this in another piece, US-India partnership works so well, it's because they merge industry and academia and government very well. And that's something that I think the Europeans need to learn from the Indians, and something that we definitely advocate for, and hopefully we'll see. I mean, but that is across the board, according to us. I mean, that could be touched upon green tech and so many other sectors.
Sorry, thank you, Amaia. Before I go to Dr. Kathuria, I have the same question from the Indian side. I wanted to just maybe ask Viktoria to quickly step in here, because Amaia mentioned the issue of data. Now, data has always been an issue where the EU and India have not really had much convergence. I know India has passed a new law. Is there more confidence in Europe for European firms on this question of data protection vis-a-vis India?
More confidence is a good question. Listen, I was approached recently from several Indian partners who were asking me, oh, now we heard the EU data protection law, it's being abolished. And, I don't know what was going on maybe on social media there to portray this picture. We will certainly, I mean, there will be amendments going on here and there for certain, but we will stronghold the data protection. And it's always seen as such a hindrance, and I know that India has a different approach to data protection, but we Europeans see it as a opportunity, and human-centric approach is what we're following when we talk about India's amazing DPI capacities. We then also, this is what we Europeans do, we think ahead and think about somebody maybe of the older age, could be also younger, who does not know what they agree upon, you know, when using certain services. So this is the approach we find. The TTC, though, opens a dialogue on this, and we will see what where India goes with the data protection on this. This is something that Europe is not easy to overlook for our own regulations. I mean, so as I said, an abolishment certainly is out of the questions, but we also learned here and there where to work, and then the GDP is not too old. So the first reviews have certainly been going on, and we'll have to wait, honestly, if there will be more convergence on this. Not an easy question to answer at this point. I see we have to go with the flow a little bit and see what happens, and how big the lobby of the industry in India and Europe actually will be in the whole process. It's going to be interesting.
Thank you. Dr. Kathuria, the same question to you from the Indian side.
Let me try and conceptualize it and then try and answer the question, which is, it's a very good question. It's a very good academic question, I think. Is there a natural convergence between Europe and India as opposed to a strategic convergence? And, it's very difficult to say whether there's a natural, what would you look at when you wish to identify natural convergence? Let's say as an economist, I would say, okay, what's the amount of trade that happens between India and the United States? What's the sort of level of foreign direct investment that happens between India and United States? What's the sort of people-to-people contact? And it's not insubstantial. It's not insignificant. So there seems to be some amount of natural convergence. But of course, the real world, I mean, if you look at the WTO, what I was mentioning, India was a sort of a complete multilateralist and inveterate multilateralist, and stayed away from free trade agreements. But the rest of the world, did free trade agreements. They did regional trade agreements. Europe is an example. Now, when Europe did a free trade agreement within itself, or an optimal currency area within itself, it said, well, there will be trade diversion within European Union, but that's the way we wish to go. So there wasn't a natural convergence because there was trade diversion, but they felt, yes, that's the way to go. And all of regional trade agreements, in some sense, are strategic convergences with the hope, and permit me to use an economist lexicon here, is I want to leverage dynamic comparative advantage as opposed to static comparative advantage. And if you approach India and EU with that lens, that there may not be sort of all across the board static comparative advantage, i.e. there may be areas of divergence, but over time, I think we could create dynamism in the comparative advantage, i.e. we could create natural comparative advantage between Europe and India. And the reason why I'm optimistic about that, Karthik, is because what has been said, what you said right in the beginning, we both prefer a rules-based order. We are both sort of democracies. We are both sort of like enforcement, although the quality of enforcement may differ. And I think India will move up the regulatory value addition. I mean, in the sense that move up the regulatory ladder. Right now, the reason why, I mean, you're talking about data and regulation, the reason why some of our regulations or rules need to be sort of brought up to the standard of, let's say, Europe. I'm using brought up in a very sort of literal perspective. I don't want to place a value on that. But if the rules need to be brought up to the European level, India will do it over a period of time and use this engagement, not the TTC, because as Viktoria is also saying, TTC is non-binding. I guess the question that you asked in some sense, but the FTA will be binding. And if we get into an FTA, then the rules our rules can then begin to slowly converge and harmonize with the European rules. So I'm optimistic that we could create dynamic comparative advantage given the shared values that we have. And I think there's with US behaving the way it is, with the universities behaving the way they are now, I think it will only catalyze this movement towards Europe, because there is a supply of Indian students who would want to go abroad, like it or not. And if US shuts its doors, then Europe would be the next geographical area where Indians will converge to.
Amaia, I want to bring you into the same conversation. I was wondering, I mean, if the conversations that are taking place within the TTC and the working groups, especially in terms of regulation, do you think there are conversations happening from India to Europe, maybe saying, look, maybe we need Europe to regulate less? Because if that would drive innovation in some of these areas, that could create new kinds of commercial partnerships, that could drive more investment in some of the areas that the TTC does focus on. Do you think that is happening at any level? So the learning also from India to Europe in terms of how much regulation there needs to happen.
Thank you, Karthik. I mean, I think the Europeans are saying this themselves. There's a sort of exercise of self-introspection happening, right? I'm not sure Europe is going to deregulate, but I do think Europe has come to realize, okay, we must regulate, but we must innovate. And I'm sure you heard about this thing about the US innovates, the Europeans regulate, and I know the Indians, I forgot what the Indians were doing. But I think that's very much in the psyche. Having said that, I mean, I know from my own work, for example, that, and Professor Kathuria was pointing to this, there is trade happening on a digital level. There are ways and means to do this. Not, you're the trade expert, but I believe it's not via principles, but via rules, because there is no FTA. So I think there is the sort of realization there are means and ways to sort of approach the issue in a less regulatory manner. But for this, and again, I want to emphasize this point, one of the key issues that I find is industry needs to come in much prior than it does at the moment. And I think, Viktoria, you're pointing to this, that my fear is that because we tend to, in Europe, regulate so much almost prior to industry sort of having a say, that's different in India, for example. As far as I know, in India, it's more industry taking the lead, and then it's a techno-nationalist model, right? So I think Europe can learn from this. And I think there is the realization, because we are between a rock and a hard place, frankly, we need to wake up, and we need to really react to the reality, not just with India, but also other strategic partners in the Global South and elsewhere, right? So I think that there is the sort of will to be more flexible, and there is the means, and we haven't touched upon this, but you can broaden this, and there was talk on this, in the recent meeting. I mean, there's also the whole defense and dual use aspect of tech, right? And that's very big sort of chapter in itself, but that's that's on the table. And there's India wants to have negotiations on a security of information agreement, for example, when it comes to defense, and so that's also part of the picture. This issues about talk about space and so many other sectors that come in. So I think there is the will definitely on an EU side to be much more flexible, but there's also red lines, and that we mentioned before, right?
Viktoria, I wanted to just bring you in here, and also get your take on whether the distinct digital philosophies of both these actors, whether they've been moving further towards one another in the discussions that have been taking place over the last 3 years on through the three working groups and the kinds of issues they discuss.
Thank you so much. Let me just quickly, with one sentence, get back to what was said right immediately before. I certainly agree. I feel like this is the ancient question: regulation, more regulation, less regulation, innovation versus regulation. However, I feel like, or I'm certain that Europe sees itself as more and more as one of the last beacons of, the protection of the individual right. I gave you the anecdote before versus DPI and also digital literacy, and where data protection comes in. One aspect we mustn't forget is also that data, our personal data, is valuable, and it's the question, who should profit from them? Should it be nations, should it be companies, or should it be the individual? And that's just Europe's stand, that as much as possible it should be us as the individuals, just to bring that in. To answer your question of the TTC's role within, the aligning tech philosophies, The idea behind the TTC at the beginning was certainly just to start the dialogue and start the alignment, see where we are congruent, where we can be more congruent in the future. And I feel like it has done a good job in this sense for both parties to get their interests abroad, like the human center aspect I talked about for the Europeans, where India also aligns, with innovation for the single person, innovations for everyday lives, apps, DPI being a very much human center technology. It's also been interesting to see how India sees its role within the whole discussion of AI. It was interesting to see how India, President Modi acting on the AI summit in Paris, and now the next AI summit happening here in Bangalore in February, I believe. And at the last AI summit, there was a focus much on the ethical use, and this is something EU and India align. I would totally put it that way. And the next AI summit chaired by India will hold the motto of the AI Impact Summit, focusing on the day-to-day impact that AI has on industry, on our everyday lives, on government and such. So this dialogue has certainly started. And then we have very concrete outputs. There have been workshops going on with regards to electric mobility, battery recycling, also a problem that both our countries face. We want more electric vehicle infrastructure, but we need a better charging infrastructure. We need recyclable batteries, and there have been actual concrete workshops and events been created, and a dialogue has been fed, and I'm looking forward how that will go on, and I'm looking forward to a lot of industry participation as well in that sort. So in that way, to conclude, it's certainly not perfect. It can never be perfect, but since we have seen concrete outcomes already on a small scale, and we have to keep in mind that the TTC is not too old, I'd say it has been very helpful so far.
So we have a lot of questions already, and I'm going to maybe ask Amaia and Dr. Kathuria one more question and then dive into the questions that are already there. Amaia, I just wanted to pick up on the point about AI. I think you mentioned it in your earlier remarks on AI hardware being an important part of ongoing discussions. I think Viktoria mentioned it as well. There are a lot of issues around AI where both partners can actually work together. There's AI safety, AI testing models, besides just the hardware part. And as I was reading the brief and how the TTC is structured, I kept thinking maybe both partners should kind of prioritize the first working group more, given the context that we are in now, given how fast the US is pushing forward on this particular issue on AI. And we already know about China's dominance here. Maybe if the EU and India can actually focus, put more attention on this relative to other issues, it could benefit not just both these partners, but a lot more.
Yes and no, I would argue. Yes, indeed. I think it's, as you mentioned, the critical sector, also one of the ones where they're both lagging behind, right? I mean, the space is really very sort of small and narrow. Sorry about the noise in the background. But having said that, actually, maybe Professor Kathuria, can you go ahead? Well, because I think there's a bit of noise in the background, and then I'll. Yeah. Otherwise, I can't hear me properly. Sorry.
No, I agree with Amaia's answer as well, Karthik. yes, there would be sort of some logic, some strategic advantage to put sort of maybe not all eggs in one basket, but in the AI basket. But of course, AI has sort of benefits across the other two working groups as well. So around clean tech, of course, there will be AI impact. On trade, there will be AI impact. So I think in a sense, what you're saying is that if we focus on that, we in fact will be covering others. But the other reason why I think all three working groups could sort of work together is in fact borrowing from what Viktoria said, is that, what is the purpose? And this is the question that you asked. I mean, both Europe and India have significant resources, at least, resources to put into working groups. Because these are not, you're creating, in some sense, if I were to, look at my past life as a policymaker, working for government, we used to go around doing stakeholder consultations a lot before we actually finalized or recommended our routes. In some sense, the TTCs, the working groups, they can continue to do what they're doing. In some sense, you're creating the momentum, you're creating the knowledge, you're creating the value add. And as I said, while they're working independently, there are spillovers from one working group to the other. Where the choice will need to be made for what to focus on will be at the level where you begin to implement, and I would say use the FTA as a manifestation of that. So while there is merit in focusing on AI, I think there's no harm in sort of creating the momentum, creating the knowledge, creating the people-to-people linkages, holding these meetings. I mean, it's much like, in your question, I like to sort of draw a metaphor with the G20. A lot of people thought after, the initial impact that the G20 had in 2008 and 9, immediately after the financial crisis, it just meandered. And a lot of people say, well, what's the value of having the G20 until there's another crisis? What would the value of the G20? In some sense, the G20 had value because it was creating knowledge, it was creating the need for reform in particular areas. Of course, it was country specific. So much like that, I think if I were to use that metaphor, the TTC is creating the value for reform, or creating the knowledge for having synergies across sectors between Europe. But that's not where the decisions are going to be made. So when it comes for time for decision making, then of course the FTA could focus much more on AI and AI-led sort of integration between Europe and India. So to that extent, I agree with you.
Very briefly, just to what extent do you think the FTA will help iron out some of these differences in standards on a number of these tech issues between Europe and India?
So I think, Karthik, if one looks at the India UK free trade agreement, which has just been, so India's commitment on standards has been on a best effort basis. And I think it's not going to be any different here. One of the reasons why India stayed away from the CPTPP or the TPP earlier and the CPTPP, despite a lot of exhortations from people, the free trade economists saying, it's good for India to join at least one large trade agreement, regional trade agreement. One of the reasons India has stayed out of these is because of the linkage of trade with standard. That's now become par for course. Environment, labor, competition, procurement, all of these standards will inextricably become linked to trade. But India doesn't want to do that immediately. So what in this FTA will happen is that India will say, on a best effort basis, I will do it. I will try and do it, but let's phase it in as we had a chance to do some of the early harvest reductions. Let's get to standards over a period of time. I think that would be the approach on a best effort basis is what India is going to do.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have a lot of questions. Let me go to that. Let's see. There was a question on, I think, the differences between the tech initiatives that India has between the UK and the US, with the US being rather security driven with India, and the national security advisors have a lot of control in the kinds of issues that are discussed, and also how things move towards certain outcomes. I guess the first question is, do you think, is there any potential for that happening between India and the EU? Yeah, Amaia or Viktoria, do you want to step in and answer that?
Just briefly, while I can speak, sorry about the noise. I think, I mean, there is, in fact, as I mentioned before, we did, in fact, a comparison between India ISET, which is now Trust, and India EU TTC. And one of the realizations was precisely this, right? That the security component with the sort of US relationship is much stronger, not just security-wise, but for example, critical minerals is included in the deal, which is really strong, and that's directly linked to green tech, for example. So I think perhaps more than security, I think it's really the sort of underlying the critical element, but also underlying the sort of strategic element. And I do think the fact of having the national security advisors meet at the top level, and then they have all sorts of engagements. They also have some sort of innovation committees, like there's the Indus X, and then there's the Indus, and so they have a whole, even within industry, right? They have all these different mechanisms that trickle down that I think, even at investor level, that I think is something that the EU could definitely adopt. It need not be only security focused. It could be focused on other aspects. So in that respect, yes, I think that's something that could be considered.
Great. The next question deals with semiconductor cooperation, sorry. What concrete practical steps can be taken in the short to medium term to enhance cooperation between both partners? Viktoria, I guess you've kind of spoken to firms on the European side on this issue, I presume?
Sure. With this, I have to put forward a little disclaimer that, of course, I have tried to do this already, but my capacity of speaking for the whole EU, as a member state, of course, are limited. So I maybe take my own member state as a little example, knowing that the EU as its own, of course, has initiatives within this as well. But for Germany and India, it's certainly a key area where we eye on cooperation. We see, we've been observing that India this year will put out the first, or open the first production of its own semiconductors, and it's getting more and more successful in research as well, and a way important partner in research. So it is not, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not one of the focus topics of the TTC itself, TTC being the topic of today, but with the geopolitical area situation as is, and us all wanting to diversify supply chains, EU, Germany, as well as India, critical minerals were also named, but the same goes for semiconductors. This is an emerging partnership that we need to have an eye on. Now coming back to the national level, on an industry to industry cooperation, there's certainly a lot of new opportunities now already happening. We have big German companies who are key, what we would call it, like within the supply chain, they're just supporting the production of the Indian chip, for example, like big chemical companies providing gas and technical solutions for chip fabrication as well as research. So on an industry level, I dare say I see partnerships first, then on a government level. However, there is no harm in that. That's actually what government also is aiming for. So with 2025 being sort of a focus year on the developments here in India, I feel like this should move more into the focus of our partnership, definitely.
Karthik, I might just
you.
mention that there is already a partnership between India and in the Netherlands, Indo-Dutch semiconductor partnership. We've mentioned, Amaia and I have mentioned that in the little policy brief, yes.
And I think ASML does have specific partnerships with different companies in India on this issue as well.
Right.
Dr. Kathuria, I guess the next question you can answer on, I think you did touch upon this in your earlier remark on the India-UK FTA, and what are the perhaps commonalities and differences do you think that could be as India negotiates an FTA with the EU?
So the commonalities, as I was saying earlier, Karthik, are the fact that we have a significant amount of trade already between the EU and India and with the individual countries as well. So therefore there is potential for that trade to grow, because at the moment the trade is subject to tariff barriers, and those tariff barriers are perhaps higher on the Indian side than they are on the European side. So there's potential for those tariff barriers to be reduced, and that's what the FTA is immediately going to focus on: reduction in tariff barriers. And as you probably know through reading of newspapers, there are some items of interest. There are some tariff lines of interest by the EU in India, and these are the wines and dairy and cheese and automobiles. And if this is reduced, India will want some market access to Europe, and market access to Europe means that in the services movement of IT professionals, which anyway Europe is inviting Indians. So the FTA will sort of already regularize that or make that as a part of the agreement, and therefore that will get formalized and institutionalized. So these are the areas of, I would say, agreement, that there's agreement to reduce tariff barriers on both sides, i.e., in other words, provide market access instruments for goods of comparative advantages or services of comparative advantage. The areas of divergence I've already touched upon are going to be standards, and what are the standards on data regulation. And one standard that is coming up for discussion, and that was mentioned briefly already, is what would happen when CBAM is already implemented, this cross-border tariff adjustment mechanism that Europe is introducing to all countries outside of Europe on 6 goods that are imported beginning 1st of January 2026. They start with steel and aluminum, and they're going to extend. So CBAM is a bit of a concern with India, and that's where the TTC can play a big role in creating the knowledge. And already I think that is being done, how Indian industry, especially the micro, small and medium enterprises, can cope with the CBAM, and how Europe can help India cope with the CBAM. I think that would be an area of interest and a discussion between Europe and India. Of course, one can take a confrontationist or adversarial position, which is that go to the WTO and file a complaint that CBAM is not compliant with the multilateral agreements, etc. I don't think it's it's fruitful going down that route for either country. Since we are negotiating a trade agreement between the two countries, then I think we should stay away from getting into adversarial positions at the start of the trade agreement. So there should be trust, and we should think of exploring ways on how India can cope with CBAM, especially in the big. I don't think the big companies, Tatas and Jindals, will have a problem. They're already adjusting to CBAM. Where the problem will lie is with the smaller and medium enterprises. And I think that's where the TTC and European-Indian collaboration and discussion and debate can actually help the situation.
Great. Thank you. So the next question is a really interesting one. So the TTC comes at a time when there was already a lot of rich scientific and research collaborations underway between Europe and India, especially a lot of technical universities in Europe and the IITs. Are there efforts to include some of these other partners within the framework or the TTC, or are the debates, which I presume are more or less driven by the regulators and strategic officials? Maybe Amaia or Viktoria, do you want to start on that first?
I can maybe just start with the short notice that I hear you. I don't know where the question comes from, but I hear you. I get where the person comes from. This is a question again between what member states already do and then what the TTC tries to do sort of additionally, I would say. Speaking for Germany, certainly there have been a lot of research cooperations going on. And as I understand TTC, what I take from the last second meeting that happened this year of the Council is that we see, as I said initially, Horizon Europe coming in there additionally, opening new funding opportunities that don't quite happen on the national level yet. So I wouldn't say that the TTC is only, driven by the bureaucrats on a regulation level. It always thinks of the funding innovation aspect as well, while being aware that there's already a lot happening on the national level.
Yeah, just to add briefly that I totally subscribe to what Viktoria was saying. I mean, I think there is obviously the sort of bilateral member states cooperation happening very strongly, but there's also a number of networks within the EU. For example, there's the European Innovation Hubs Network. And there's also the example that we mentioned in our report about the EU's next generation internet, right? Where you do have like EU funding and how you have different entities coming together and actually for making these projects operational. So I think in that respect, that's very much the aim. But again, coordination needs to happen on both sides first, and then between both sides. This is another one of the caveat that we also mentioned, that it's not just the bilateral sort of coordination between actors, but also among themselves, which, as we know, at least from an EU perspective, is quite a challenge in itself. So, yeah.
Karthik, as you said, it's a very interesting question. And the way, I'd like to think about it is, as a metaphor with think about an individual researcher, think about yourself, or think about, let's say, how do you choose a research topic? And I say, choose a research topic where you feel that you would probably find the kind of results that you want. You have a sort of, whether it's, positive or negative, but you sort of choose something that you feel you're not going completely with your eyes closed. You have some idea, and then you begin to do the research. I mean, I think a lot of people do that. For example, if you would think, what is the impact of DPI? A lot of people would engage in the impacts of DPI because it's having substantial impact, and you want to see what is the quantitative impact. I look at the TTC much the same way. The fact that there already existed the initial conditions between Europe and India to engage, I think the two governments decided that, hey, why don't we formalize and institutionalize this? Because it already exists. And that way we'll be able to sort of leverage it even more. And so when you institutionalize it, as Amaia and Viktoria are saying, you're getting more and more people involved, not just bureaucrats and regulators, but you're getting more of the academic community to be involved in some way. So I think of the TTC in that respect, and of course, it will feed into other areas as well. It'll increase partnership for its own sake. It'll increase research between India and EU for its own sake, but it will also provide fodder, in a sense, grist to the mill of the FTA in another sense, yes.
So I'm going to combine the next question because the next two questions, sorry, and make it into one, on structural and regulatory challenges hindering deeper EU-India tech cooperation. And then the question after that talks about CBAM. So the CBAM question, Dr. Kathuria, you started talking about it, how
Yes.
it's disadvantageous for the MSMEs. Is there anything else you would want to add to that?
I would say that, that there is a debate within India on whether, and I'm sure Viktoria and Amaia are familiar with this, is that Europe is doing this for protecting its own domestic industry, and there's an element of protectionism. And I think there's a legacy of how standards have been used for protectionism in the WTO between countries trading, and there's a legacy of that. And I think there's a sort of spillover of that into this discussion as well. So I think a lot of the discussion comes from legacy issues of standards and trade linkages. But I think Europe and the European Commission in India, and I know the European ambassador to India has gone at length to try and communicate that what Europe is doing is not really for protectionism, it's to prevent carbon leakage. And Europe, we know, is really committed to the idea and to the ideals of sustainability, and they want to become net zero by 2050. And I think, fit for 2020, 55% reduction by 2030, fit for purpose, etc. So I think one has to take it in that spirit and not sort of continuously say that CBAM now becomes protectionist and therefore we are going to oppose it. So if we take it in that positive sense, and the fact that sort of big Indian industry, which is at world-class levels already, I think the Jindals and the Tatas, there's no doubt about that. They're some of the biggest steel plants. You leave out China, then the scale of the steel production in India is the second largest in the world. So they'll be able to cope. The challenge I think Europe needs to address, along with India in a collaborative manner, is what sort of tech transfer and what sort of financial transfers are to be able to help the MSMEs address the challenge of CBAM. It's not that Indians themselves have a lot of problems with sustainability. We know the weather change pattern, we know climate change, and so a lot of it is local, right? It's not sort of global. A lot of it is happening because of the local impact. So we recognize that we need to do something, but we put up our hands and say we can't afford it. And so what role can Europe play in both tech as well as financial? I think that'll be a really fruitful discussion, a beneficial discussion to have. So that's what I would say about CBAM.
There's also another big question. Sorry, Viktoria, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was just really short, completely agree. And thank you for, as a European, I'm representing EU today. Thank you for highlighting this aspect. Two aspects to add here. Like one, you kind of said, put yourself into the EU's perspective, which is, I'm really grateful for this because you mentioned the net zero plans, and the thought behind CBAM is that it's not a competitive, we don't want to position ourselves better, but we can't let ourselves being protected worse than we were before with the net zero plan. So this is kind of why CBAM was implemented with the ambition plans for the net zero. And adding on this is, of course, I urge everybody, this is what the EU stands for, to see the long-term range. We are all parties of the UNFCCC. We want sustainable development, and from our position is that this is the only way we get there. And but of course, we see that everybody has different positions where they're coming from.
So I want to end with one big question.
If I can just add very quickly, very pragmatically, just to say that I was thinking of the recently signed EU-Mercosur agreement, which this was also a topic, and this is a sort of consistent topic in most, I would argue, FTAs that the EU is signing with different sort of global south partners. And I think there too, there's sort of mechanisms that are being found. Sometimes it's because they're more sector specific, or sometimes because there's compensation mechanisms that are being introduced. So I think that there is a means around it, and I think we have to be pragmatic. And I just wanted to add, as a sort of provocatory note, that the UK too will have its own CBAM, and India just signed a FTA agreement. So that's something to sort of keep in the back of your minds.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's one question which I think we haven't addressed that I want to cover before going to the final one, and that's on China. How does Europe and India see the urgency and the importance of tech cooperation, given their respective China concerns? Does the TTC help here in any regard? Amaia, do you want to just quickly take that perhaps, and then we can move to the last question?
I mean, very briefly, I think China is definitely the white elephant in the room, certainly for India, too for the Europeans. But right now, I was looking at there's this report about digital, well, generally, and the bulk of leading tech companies at the moment are not Chinese. They're actually American, US bound or based, right? So I think we need not only hyper-focus on China, but also, at least from a European perspective right now, we need to focus on both China and the US.
Dr. Kathuria, do you want to just quickly come in there from the Indian perspective? I mean, India needs China for investment in technology and all, especially the green industries. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the solar panels in India are coming from China. China is the largest trading partner for
seems Dr. Kathuria seems to have
the value chain. So diversifying the value chains away from China is something that India wants to do, wishes to do. And I think Amaia is right. This is the right time for looking at alternatives for India, and which is why the UK, EU, and even the United States Free Trade Agreement, which India is talking about, believe it or not, one didn't think that India and the US would begin to talk about an FTA. But I think these three trade agreements with countries, with these technologically advanced regions or countries, will stand India in good stead and as a mechanism to diversify away from China. But it won't happen in the short term. As I said, most of our components for the mobile phones, most of our components for our EVs, most of our components for solar panels are still coming from China. Over $100 billion of imports come in from China every year. So I think that's a concern for India, given the sort of relationship that we have, increasingly a military conflict type of relationship. So I think there will be a need to diversify away from China. China is the elephant in the room. And I think there's no getting away from that fact. Yes.
So I have one final question, which I hope you will all answer very briefly and fast, since we have about 2 minutes left. So where do you see the EU-India TTC in 5 years? And maybe I'll start with Dr. Kathuria first, and then Viktoria, and end with Amaia in reverse order.
So I think in 5 years, I would like to see the TTC dissolved and in some sense leading to the FTA. And having had the FTA, then to create sort of different kinds of working groups around what the FTA throws up. So the TTC should lead up to the FTA. FTA should be signed and maybe get rolling, and then the TTC in its current form should be dissolved, and whatever issues the FTA throws up, then we should have new working groups created.
Viktoria?
I would say, coming in from the research science perspective, maybe that I would like to see more concrete outcomes, win-win situations where both EU and India can say, listen, we've built this, we've implemented this, be it innovation, be it new on the regulatory, or not regulatory side, but on the paper side, these negotiations, we started this, see here, because the TTC has a lot of possibilities for very concrete outcomes.
Just briefly, yes, in the ideal world, an EU-India FTA there in place, that would be amazing. And I would see the TTC, I do think it should remain, but it's something much more pragmatic, sort of a mechanism where you have in different, not necessarily in the current working groups, but definitely in different, maybe a sectorial approach, where you bring in, as I said, this sort of ecosystem idea where you have industry, policy makers, academics coming in different sectors. That to me would be a sort of added value still.
Great. Thank you so much. So we are out of time. Let me just end with a quick note on the discussion. I think the mark of a good discussion is the kinds of questions it raises. And we've really had a lot of good questions and could have had a lot more. I think without a doubt, the EU-India relationship is an important one and will only get more important going ahead, with technology playing a seminal role in that relationship. I think, as we've discussed today, there will be bumps on the road. There will be zigs and zags. But I suspect these structural logics that are driving the EU and India in the TTC and beyond will remain. And the issues discussed through the TTC will only get more important. And this brief really helps us understand where we are and where we're going into the future. So let me thank you again. Thank all the speakers. Thank HBS and CSDR for bringing us all together here.
Thank you, Karthik. That was expertly moderated. Dot 3:30, we have concluded. I just want to quickly thank all our panelists and our attendees for joining us today. Like Karthik mentioned, very interesting questions. We've got a very interested audience today. The discussion has been incredibly timely and relevant. And I mean, what more is there to say, as the current landscape is incredibly uncertain, but it has somehow had a positive impact in terms of momentum and political backing for the EU-India relationship. I also want to say we look forward to continue to engage with HBS on this incredibly important relationship. We will be back in early July with the next report of our series, Green Horizons, Leveraging the EU-India Partnership on Climate Action, which this discussion has actually very nicely segued us into. So yeah, thank you to our panelists again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.